Malachi Brooks stood before Judge Harlan with ink still wet on his fingers, staring at a woman who towered over him like a mountain over a valley. The crowd behind them erupted in cheers and applause, throwing rice and flower petals, while Willa Blaine looked down at him with eyes that seemed to hold both amusement and something else he couldn't quite read. He had walked into the courthouse 30 minutes ago to sign a simple land deed. Now somehow he was married. The judge's voice boomed across the packed room. "You may kiss your bride." Malachi's throat went dry. He looked up at Willa, who stood nearly a full head taller than him, her broad shoulders filling out a simple but clean dress. Her hands, he noticed, were larger than his own, calloused from work he could only imagine. The crowd waited in expectant silence, and he realized with growing horror that everyone in town was watching this moment unfold. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," Malachi whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the gathered townspeople. Willa leaned down slightly, her voice low but clear. "There's no mistake. Cowboy, you signed the papers. I signed the papers. The judge pronounced us married." Her tone carried no anger, just a matter-of-fact certainty that made his stomach drop even further. Judge Harlan cleared his throat impatiently. "Well, the ceremony isn't complete until—" "Right," Malachi stammered, looking around the room full of expectant faces. Some smiled encouragingly, others whispered behind their hands, and a few children had climbed onto chairs to get a better view. He had never felt smaller in his entire life. As he stood on his tiptoes to reach Willa's cheek, she surprised him by meeting him halfway, bending down so he wouldn't have to stretch so far. Her skin was warm against his lips, and when she straightened up, she offered him the slightest smile, not mocking but almost kind. The crowd erupted again, and suddenly everyone was pressing forward to congratulate them. Old Mrs. Henderson grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Oh, Malachi, she'll make you a fine wife. Look at those strong arms. She'll keep you well-fed and protected." Protected. The word stung more than he cared to admit. He caught sight of himself in the courthouse window, a scrawny cowboy who barely came up to his new wife's shoulder, looking lost and overwhelmed, while she stood beside him with an almost regal composure. But as the crowd began to disperse and people started talking about a celebration at the saloon, Malachi noticed something that made his blood run cold. Willa was gathering up the papers from Judge Harlan's desk, and among them was a document he definitely hadn't intended to sign. A marriage certificate with his signature clear as day at the bottom. The land deed he'd actually come for was nowhere to be seen. Malachi's hands trembled as he approached Judge Harlan, who was busy organizing the remaining papers on his desk. The courthouse had mostly emptied, leaving only a handful of stragglers discussing the unexpected wedding they'd just witnessed. Willa stood near the window, her back to him, seemingly studying something in the street below. "Judge Harlan," Malachi began, his voice cracking slightly, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I came here to sign papers for the Henderson property, not to get married." The judge looked up with bushy eyebrows raised. "Henderson property? Son, there hasn't been any Henderson property for sale in months. Old Henderson died last winter, and his land went to his nephew back east." He shuffled through his papers with deliberate slowness. "The only papers I had ready today were these marriage documents that Miss Blaine requested." Malachi felt the blood drain from his face. "Miss Blaine requested marriage papers? But I don't even know her." He turned toward Willa, who had now shifted to face them, her expression unreadable. "We've never even spoken before today." "That's not entirely true," Willa said quietly, stepping closer. Her voice carried a weight that made him pay attention despite his panic. "You spoke to me 3 weeks ago outside Morrison's general store. You asked me to move because I was blocking the entrance with my wagon." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had been in a hurry, frustrated by the crowd, and yes, he had spoken sharply to someone about moving their wagon, but he barely remembered the encounter, certainly hadn't paid attention to who it was. "You told me," Willa continued, her voice steady but with an edge he was beginning to recognize, "that big people should be more considerate of others trying to get by, that some of us take up more space than we should." Malachi's stomach twisted. He remembered now, not just the words, but the dismissive tone he'd used, the way he'd gestured impatiently. He'd been having a bad day, and he'd taken it out on a stranger who was simply trying to load supplies into her wagon. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. "Miss Blaine came to me last week with a proposition. She said a certain cowboy had expressed interest in marriage but was too shy to ask properly. She had the papers drawn up and asked me to have them ready when he came in to sign his land documents. But there were no land documents, Malachi said weakly. No, the judge agreed. But you signed the marriage papers readily enough. Didn't even read them from what I could see. Just signed your name where I pointed. Willa stepped forward, and despite her size, her movement was surprisingly graceful. You assumed those papers were what you wanted them to be, just like you assumed I was just some inconsiderate woman blocking your way. Maybe it's time you started paying attention to what's actually in front of you. The few remaining townspeople had gone quiet, clearly listening to every word. Malachi realized this conversation was about to become the talk of the entire town, and with it, his reputation as the man who accidentally married a woman who clearly had orchestrated the whole thing. But why would she want to marry a complete stranger who had been rude to her? The silence stretched uncomfortably until Willa moved toward the courthouse door, her heavy footsteps echoing in the nearly empty room. We should discuss this somewhere more private, she said, glancing meaningfully at the remaining onlookers who were straining to hear every word. Malachi followed her outside, his mind racing. The afternoon sun felt harsh against his skin, and he squinted as they walked toward the shade of a large oak tree beside the courthouse. Several townspeople lingered nearby, pretending to be busy with their own affairs while obviously hoping to catch more of this unexpected drama. Why? Malachi asked once they were relatively alone. Why would you want to marry someone who was rude to you? Someone you don't even know? Willa leaned against the tree trunk, her height making her seem even more imposing in the dappled sunlight. Because you're exactly the kind of man who needs to learn what it's like to be judged by your appearance instead of your character. Her words were matter of fact, but he caught something else underneath. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. This is about revenge? Malachi's voice rose higher than he intended. You tricked me into marriage for revenge. Not revenge, Willa corrected. Education. She crossed her arms, and he couldn't help but notice how the gesture emphasized her considerable strength. Do you know what it's like to have people cross the street to avoid walking near you? To have mothers pull their children closer when you pass by? To be treated like you're dangerous just because you're bigger than everyone else? Malachi shifted uncomfortably. He had never really thought about what life might be like for someone who stood out the way Willa did. But that doesn't give you the right to trick me into marriage. And your assumptions about me don't give you the right to be cruel to strangers, she shot back. But here we are. Before Malachi could respond, he heard familiar voices approaching. His heart sank as he recognized his business partner, Tom Bradley, walking toward them with two other men from the cattle ranch where Malachi worked. Tom's expression shifted from confusion to barely contained laughter as he took in the scene. Well, well, Tom called out, his grin widening with each step. Malachi Brooks, you dark horse. When were you planning to tell us about your bride? He looked Willa up and down with undisguised amazement. Though I have to say, partner, she could probably toss you clear into next week if she had a mind to. The other men laughed, and Malachi felt heat creep up his neck. This was exactly what he'd been dreading, becoming the subject of jokes and speculation throughout the territory. Tom clapped him on the back with enough force to make him stumble slightly. Don't look so glum, Tom continued. A wife like this one could be mighty useful around the ranch. Bet she could handle more cattle than half our crew combined. Willa's jaw tightened, and Malachi saw something flash in her eyes that made him suddenly very aware of just how strong she probably was. Is that how you see women? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. As useful tools for your work? Tom's grin faltered slightly, but he pressed on. Well now, ma'am, I just meant... You meant that my worth is measured by how much manual labor I can provide, Willa finished. Just like your friend here measured my worth by how much space I was taking up. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Malachi realized he was about to witness something that would either teach Tom Bradley a lesson he wouldn't forget, or end very badly for everyone involved. Tom Bradley had dealt with plenty of difficult people in his years running cattle, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Willa Blaine. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until Tom had to crane his neck to look up at her face. The two men behind him instinctively took a step back. You know what's interesting about men like you, Willa said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse yard. You think strength is only worth something when it serves your purposes. When a woman is strong enough to help you, she's useful. When she's strong enough to challenge you, she's a problem. Tom's face reddened, but his voice remained steady. Now see here, ma'am. I was just making conversation. No need to get all worked up. Worked up? Willa's eyebrows rose. I'm perfectly calm. But since you seem so interested in what I can do, perhaps I should show you." Before anyone could react, Willa walked over to Tom's horse, a large gelding that had been standing patiently tied to the courthouse fence. Without apparent effort, she lifted the animal's rear hoof and began examining it as if checking for stones. The horse, which Malachi knew could be temperamental with strangers, stood perfectly still for her. "Your horse has been favoring his left rear leg," Willa observed, lowering the hoof gently. "There's a small crack in the shoe that's putting pressure on the frog. If you don't get it fixed soon, he'll go lame." Tom stared at her, then at his horse, then back at her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I pay attention," Willa replied simply. "I notice when things are hurting, even when they're trying to hide it." Her eyes shifted meaningfully to Malachi. "It's a useful skill when people don't always say what they mean." Malachi felt an uncomfortable twist in his stomach. There was something in the way she looked at him that suggested she saw more than he was comfortable with. Tom, meanwhile, was running his hand down his horse's leg, clearly finding the truth in what Willa had said. "Well, I'll be," Tom muttered. "How did you learn about horses?" "My father was a farrier before he died," Willa said. "I grew up around horses, cattle, and men who thought they knew everything about both." She turned her attention back to Malachi. "Including men who judge others without taking the time to understand what they're really looking at." The pointed comment hit its mark, and Malachi found himself studying Willa with new eyes. Her movements around Tom's horse had been confident and practiced. Her assessment had been accurate and helpful, not the fumbling of someone pretending to knowledge she didn't possess. How many other assumptions had he made about her that were completely wrong? "We should head back to the ranch," Tom said awkwardly, clearly unsettled by the entire encounter. "Malachi, you coming with us?" "Or?" He gestured vaguely between Malachi and Willa. Malachi realized that everyone was waiting for his answer, and that whatever he chose would set the tone for everything that followed. He looked at Willa, who was watching him with those same unreadable eyes, and wondered what exactly she expected him to do now that they were legally married to each other. The problem was, he had no idea what he expected of himself. Malachi looked between Tom and Willa, acutely aware that his next words would either brand him as a coward who abandoned his accidental wife, or commit him to a situation he still didn't fully understand. The courthouse yard had grown quiet except for the distant sounds of the town going about its daily business, but he could feel the weight of expectation from everyone present. "I'll stay," he heard himself say, surprising even himself. "Tom, I'll catch up with you later." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "You sure about that, partner? We've got that shipment coming in tomorrow and—" "The shipment can wait," Malachi interrupted, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he needed that work. The cattle ranch job was the steadiest income he'd had in months, and Tom Bradley wasn't known for his patience with unreliable employees. After Tom and his men rode off, shaking their heads and muttering among themselves, Malachi found himself alone with Willa under the oak tree. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, neither seeming to know how to break it. "You didn't have to stay," Willa said finally. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "What I want," Malachi replied, "is to understand why you did this. Really why. Because revenge for a rude comment seems like an awful lot of trouble to go to." Willa was quiet for so long that Malachi wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it before. 3 weeks ago, when you told me to move my wagon, I had just come from the doctor's office. He told me that my mother was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do about it." The words hit Malachi like a physical blow. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," Willa continued. "You didn't ask. You saw a large woman taking up space and inconveniencing you, and that was all you needed to see. But in that moment, when I was trying to hold myself together and figure out how to care for a dying woman all by myself, your words were the final weight that broke something inside me." Malachi felt sick. "Willa, I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she said, but her tone wasn't cruel. "Sorry doesn't change the fact that you're the kind of man who judges first and thinks later. But maybe," she looked at him directly for the first time since they'd left the courthouse, "maybe being married to someone you misjudged will teach you to be different." Before Malachi could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of an older woman he recognized as Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house where he'd been staying. Her expression was grim, and she walked with the purposeful stride of someone delivering bad news. "Malachi Brooks," she called out, while still several yards away. I hope you have somewhere else to sleep tonight because you're no longer welcome at my establishment. Malachi's heart sank. Mrs. Patterson, what are you talking about? Word travels fast in a town this size, she replied curtly. And I don't rent rooms to men who trick innocent women into marriage for their money or property. Whatever game you're playing with Miss Blaine here, you can play it somewhere else. Willa stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Has there? The older woman's sharp eyes moved between them. Because what I heard was that this man convinced you to marry him under false pretenses, and now he's stuck with more than he bargained for. Malachi realized with growing horror that the story spreading through town was the exact opposite of what had actually happened, and that his reputation was being destroyed based on completely wrong information. Willa stepped between Malachi and Mrs. Patterson, her considerable frame casting a shadow over the older woman. The misunderstanding is yours, Mrs. Patterson. This man didn't trick me into anything. If anyone was deceived today, it was him. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? I'm saying I arranged this marriage, not him, Willa replied calmly. Malachi came to sign land papers and left with a wife he never asked for. If anyone should be angry, it's him. The boarding house owner looked between them with obvious confusion. But why would you? I mean, no offense, dear, but what man wouldn't want to marry you for your property? Everyone knows you inherited the largest ranch in the territory when your father died. Malachi's head snapped toward Willa. You own a ranch? Willa's jaw tightened. The Blaine Ranch, 2,000 acres of the best grazing land in 3 counties. She looked at Mrs. Patterson with obvious irritation. Though I'd appreciate it if people would stop assuming that's the only reason someone might want to marry me. Mrs. Patterson had the grace to look embarrassed. Well, I suppose I jumped to conclusions. Yes, Willa said firmly. You did, and now you're going to unjump them and give my husband his room back. The word husband hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Malachi felt a strange mix of pride and terror at hearing himself described that way. Mrs. Patterson, meanwhile, was clearly wrestling with her mistake. Of course, she said finally. Mr. Brooks, I apologize for my hasty words. Your room is available whenever you need it. After Mrs. Patterson hurried away, Malachi turned to Willa with new understanding dawning. You own the largest ranch in the territory, and you tricked a broke cowboy into marrying you. Why? Because a broke cowboy was the only kind of man I could be sure wasn't after my money, Willa replied. Every eligible bachelor for 100 miles has been sniffing around since my father died, and not one of them has looked at me like I'm anything more than a deed to valuable property. Malachi thought about this, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. But why marriage? Why not just, I don't know, hire me to work for you if you needed help with the ranch? Because hired hands can quit when the work gets difficult, Willa said. Husbands are supposed to stick around through the hard times. Her voice carried a weight that suggested she was talking about more than ranch work. What kind of hard times? Willa was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. My mother is dying, Malachi. The doctor says she has maybe 2 months left, and she needs constant care. The ranch hands can manage the cattle and horses, but they can't help me with her. I need someone who won't run when things get ugly and painful. The raw honesty in her voice caught him off guard. So you chose me because you thought I'd be too weak to leave? I chose you because you seemed like the kind of man who might understand what it's like to feel powerless, Willa corrected. And because despite being rude to me, you weren't cruel. There's a difference. Before Malachi could ask what she meant, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A young man on a sweating horse rode hard toward them, pulling up short when he spotted Willa. Miss Blaine, he called out breathlessly. You need to come home right now, it's your mother. Willa was already moving toward the young rider before he finished speaking. What happened, Danny? She collapsed in the kitchen about an hour ago, Danny replied, dismounting quickly. Maria got her to bed, but she's been asking for you. Doc Peterson is on his way out from town, but he glanced uncertainly at Malachi. Who's this? My husband, Willa said without hesitation, and Malachi felt that strange mix of pride and panic again. Danny, can you get us a wagon? My horse is still at the livery stable. Already got one waiting, Danny said, pointing toward the street where a buckboard sat ready. Figured you'd want to get home fast. The ride to the Blaine Ranch took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Willa sat rigid beside Malachi on the wagon seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She hadn't spoken since they'd left town, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. The ranch house, when it came into view, was larger and more impressive than Malachi had expected. 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wide front porch and well-maintained outbuildings scattered across the valley. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and several ranch hands stopped their work to watch the wagon approach. Inside the house, they were met by a middle-aged Mexican woman who introduced herself as Maria, the housekeeper. Her face was creased with worry as she led them upstairs to a sunlit bedroom where an older woman lay propped up against pillows, her breathing shallow and labored. Eleanor Blaine had clearly once been as tall and strong as her daughter, but illness had reduced her to a frail shadow. Her eyes, however, were still sharp and alert as they focused on Malachi with unmistakable curiosity. "So this is the young man who married my daughter," she said, her voice weak but carrying clear amusement. "You're smaller than I expected." "Mother," Willa said, moving to the bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "Which, according to the doctor, I am. But I'm more interested in hearing about this sudden wedding. Danny tells me half the town is talking about it." Malachi found himself under scrutiny from both women and realized that whatever he said next would determine how the rest of this very strange day would unfold. Eleanor Blaine was clearly nobody's fool, and lying to a dying woman seemed particularly wrong. "Mrs. Blaine," he began carefully, "I think there are some things about today that might surprise you." "Oh, I do hope so," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling despite her obvious weakness. "I haven't been surprised by anything in months. Dying is terribly boring, you know. Now tell me, young man, what exactly did my daughter do to trap you into marriage?" The directness of the question caught Malachi completely off guard. He looked at Willa, who was staring at her mother with obvious shock. "How did you know?" Willa asked. Eleanor smiled weakly. "Because I know you, my dear. And because no man accidentally marries the strongest woman in the territory, unless she has a very good reason for making sure he does." Eleanor's knowing smile faded as she looked between her daughter and Malachi, waiting for an answer that would determine the future of everyone in the room. Malachi realized this was the moment when he had to decide who he really was and who he wanted to become. "Your daughter did trick me into marriage," Malachi said finally. "But she did it because I proved to her that I was the kind of man who judges people without knowing anything about them. 3 weeks ago, I was rude to her when she was dealing with news about your illness." "Mrs. Blaine, I treated her like she was just an obstacle in my way." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And what kind of man are you now?" Malachi looked at Willa, who was watching him with those same unreadable eyes, though he thought he detected something softer in them now. "I'm the kind of man who wants to learn to do better. Your daughter was right about me, and she was right to think I needed to understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly." "But," Eleanor prompted, clearly hearing the unspoken word, "but I don't want to stay married to someone who doesn't trust me enough to ask for help instead of tricking me into it," Malachi continued. "And I don't think Willa should have to settle for a husband who only stays because he feels trapped." Willa's expression shifted. And for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we're going to be married, it should be because we choose each other, not because of tricks or accidents or convenience," Malachi replied. "I'm saying that I'd like to stay and help you with your mother and the ranch, but as your partner, not your prisoner." Eleanor's weak laugh filled the room. "Well, that's the most sensible thing anyone has said all day." She reached out and took Willa's hand with obvious effort. "My dear, this young man is offering you exactly what you've always wanted. Someone who sees you for who you are and chooses to stay anyway." Willa's eyes glistened as she looked at her mother, then at Malachi. "You really want to stay? Even knowing that my mother is dying and the ranch is more work than one person can handle and I can be difficult and stubborn?" "Especially knowing all of that," Malachi said. "But I want to stay as your husband by choice, not by accident. So the question is, would you choose to marry me if you met me today, knowing what you know about who I really am?" Willa was quiet for a long moment, and Malachi held his breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "Yes, I would choose you. Not because you're perfect, but because you're willing to admit when you're wrong and work to be better." Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then I suppose you'd better have a proper wedding ceremony, this time with both of you knowing exactly what you're signing." 6 months later, Eleanor Blaine died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her daughter and the son-in-law who had learned to see past appearances to the person underneath. Malachi and Willa had their second wedding ceremony the week after the funeral, this time with both of them reading every word of the papers they signed. The Blaine Ranch prospered under their joint management, and the town eventually stopped talking about the day Malachi Brooks accidentally married the strongest woman in the territory and discovered she was exactly what he'd been looking for all along. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.